I'm not able to see you at the same time present. So in case if you have something, please don't hesitate to stop me and ask questions. So before I formally begin the talk, I'll just say a few words about the institute where I belong to. So as already mentioned, I'm from IIIT Kottayam, a relatively newer institution, which got established in the year 2015. And we have different programs, including undergraduate, postgraduate, and also PhD programs. And one of the significance or USP of IIIT Kottayam is that we have a unique MTech for working professionals, where we offer this program to industry persons. And we have around 250 students from around 133 different IT companies. And just a few snippets of the campus. And in case if you are coming down to Kerala, you're always welcome to visit the campus, and always open for research discussions. And as already mentioned by Dr. Rachel, I belong to the data science research group, and we have around 15 faculty in this research group working on various subdomains of data science, as well as responsible AI. Now, moving on to the so let me just confirm. Hope the slides are visible and it is changing as well. Uh,
Yes, I mean it's visible.
yes, yes, yeah, fine. Yes. So when Rachel asked me about this particular winter school, which consists of computational social science students, uh, she asked me whether I could deliver something related to data visualization. So this whole talk will not be a complete technical talk. What I like to do is that I'll just try to give uh, a an overview about certain aspects of data visualization. So that's what my intention is all about. And as you all know, the world runs on data. So if you statistically think about the data being generated every day, it amounts to more than 3 quadrillion bytes of data. And the pace in which we create data is accelerating rapidly, because both people as well as things generate data. So with this increased pace of data generation, uh, it has emerged the language of data to, or it has emerged as the language of data to help business communicate with each other in this new era. So what is this language of data, or how do you communicate with it, and what is it used for? So if you think about data, if it is just collected and stored so that it can be forgotten, then it may not make much sense. So all businesses, they use it to make decision and also inform their thinking or their thought process from the patterns what they've analyzed from this data. So if you take a very mundane example such as choosing a hotel, the data you collect to inform that decision would be to look at the location of the hotel, the cost, or, or the facilities, or the amenities, and then you compare that to the budget that you have, right? With what amenities you want or what facilities you want in the hotel. And you might also consider how long you need to be at the hotel based on your travel itinerary. So this is all that data which you have collected to inform a data driven decision on what hotel you want to select. So in the world of business, this kind of decision making is done every single day at all levels of business. And data is the new lifeblood of business, and visualization has emerged as the common language. So effective communication with data is now a must have skill for all employees at all levels. And every single person in any organization is expected to speak this new language if they want to participate in a world driven by data. So we can think about any real life encounter of data communication. It could be something like a fitness tracker, or it could be your mobile phone, all these devices constantly generate a lot of data, right? So, or in other words, all these examples, they're communicating in the language of data. So, in order to be part of this kind of a workplace, we should be able to speak that language. And from an industry perspective, if you think companies are so reliant on data, is that uh, being able to confidently work on a spreadsheet or generating graphs and basically uh, it could be simple graphs, it could be fancy graphs, and ultimately the employee now needs to be able to create impactful and meaningful charts so that he or she could be able to resonate what he or she has done with an audience, right? So the data and information could both be correct between two employees, but the employee that can create a clear accessible message with the maybe proper formatted data visualization will be ahead of the other employee. So speaking this language isn't about learning numbers or maths or statistics, but it's more about visual thinking and uh, like I can say like to be storytelling skills applied to graphs and charts. So in this talk, I'll be talking in general about data communication or what is the significance of visualizing this data, and I'll touch upon little bit aspects about visual design and communicating. How do you communicate visually? And towards the end, we'll conclude with how do you actually turn these visualization into your story. So usually this is offered as a 4 credit course for postgraduate students. So in 1 hour, I'll try to give just a primer to this data visualization and how do you convey your story to an audience. That is the uh, objective of this whole talk, right? So when you say that speaking the language of data is the intersection between data visualization and it has also got something to do with good practice of visual and design thinking. So usually uh, when we talk about engineers, what happens is if an engineer is generating a graph, there is this odd feeling among engineers that if you say something simple, then like the general feeling, what an engineer feels is that if I keep it simple, then people may think that I haven't done much work. So there is always this tendency to make things complicated and also complex, and that happens with respect to visualization as well, right? So a graph can be analyzed to provide insight to the business, and it can drive decisions with data. But if you think about a standard bar chart which you can generate using an excel or a spreadsheet, that may not say a whole lot to an audience, and basically it may not be able to convey any sort of analytical say analytical output, right? So how do you enhance that bar chart in order to resonate with your audience? So data visualization needs to be uh, enhanced if it's gonna resonate with an audience. You need to get it connected with your audience. So how do you create impactful data visualizations? So to do so, I think we should take a step back and ask this question: what is data communication? So data visualization is an kind of encompassing term that refers to the uh, techniques used to communicate data and information to an audience by use of some visual objects. It could be points, it could be lines, it could be bars on a graph, and or else in a simple way, I can say that it's simply a visual display of data, even raw data. So any instance where you take data and display it visually, then you can say that to be data visualization. So data visualization, as I mentioned, it can vary in complexity. So you can see here a very fancy graph, but it may not be uh, conveying much information. It looks very complicated, and you can have some simple graph like this, just a number. So a graph is simply a display of numbers. So it is only when those numbers are looked at and interpreted with the proper business context, with the purpose of maybe informing a decision, then only a graph start telling some story, right? So if a graph is just a data visualization, if or if data communication is when single or multiple visualizations are used along with some visual communication to convey a message. So, but in general, data communication could be in any form. It could be reports, it could be tables, it could be dashboards, infographics, or even presentations. So, the goal of data visualization is to maybe clearly and effectively communicate information to an audience so that they'd be able to take a decision based on that. So there's one very famous graphic designer by the name Fredman. He has written a lot of books related to this designs as well as design thinking. So uh, he has mentioned in a book called Design Lover. I think it got published in the year 2008. So he has mentioned that the main goal of data visualization is to communicate information clearly and effectively through any graphical means. It doesn't mean that visualization needs to look boring or complicated or uh, like or sophisticated uh, to look beautiful and convey the message. But to convey ideas effectively, both aesthetic form and functional forms could be used to kind of give that insight. But often, uh, designers, especially data visualization creators or data scientists, they often fail to achieve a balance between this form and function. So which means that you create a very gorgeous data visualization which failed to serve the main purpose, that is to communicate information to the audience. So to achieve a balance between form and function graphs, which we can make sure that it is accurate and it contains the right data. uh, so if you're just putting that, it will just look like numbers to that audience and it may not convey much. The reason is they may not be designed properly and they fail to achieve their purpose, which is again communicate information. So as I mentioned, you can have really stunning beautiful graph that doesn't really say anything to the viewer about the business or really what exactly you want to convey to the audience, right? So having a balance between this form and function, that is the key aspect in any data communication, right? So whether it is an weather map or an airplane seating chart or the dashboard of your car or maybe a chart which shows the performance of maybe some industrial average or some industrial performance, or let it be something very simple like a fitness tracker. So all these involve or may involve visual display of data. So you can have charts, you can have graphs, you can have maps, and basically the ability to process information visually, that is very strong. So numerical data that have been displayed in a chart, graph, or map, they allow or they kind of try to convey the relationship between variables in that particular data set, whatever you're looking into. So trends, patterns, or distribution of data, it could be very easily comprehended when it is being uh, displayed visually, right? So effective data communication is one that is clear, easy to understand, and it should have an impact on the viewer. So it is one that tells a story, right? So uh, the famous author Edward Tufte, in his 1983 book named Visual Display of Quantitative Information, which is a very good book, where he defines this graphical displays and principles for effective graphical display as like say excellence in statistics or graphics It consists of complex ideas communicated with clarity, precision, and efficiency. So, graphical displays should show data, and it should introduce to the viewer to think about the substance rather than about the methodology or graphic design or the technology of graphic production or something else, right? So, basically, avoid distorting what the data has to say. So there are many aspects to this which could not be covered in a single lecture. So I'm just trying to give a very peripheral overview about this aspect. Right? So in a nutshell, I can say that data visualization is the secret of turning data into visual graphics that people can understand. So when I'm saying visual graphics, it can mean graphs, charts, or infographics. So any of these things, right? So the reason why it is so important is to uh, allow human eye to see the trends and patterns that it cannot otherwise make out from a textual data. If you give a table and try to convey to the audience, it may not be that much impactful, right? So visual images win every time, right? So uh, so in short, uh, as I mentioned, visual data is easier to remember than words. So there are multiple studies which shows that only 10 to 20 percentage of written or spoken data is remembered, while 65 percentage of information uh, is remembered when it is presented visually. So that's why it is important to present your data visually. So it ensures that your information is processed faster and it is also more easily understood and remembered. So uh, data visualization is your map to understanding information and gives you clear directions on where to go or what is the current scenario, right? On top of that, when this whole process is done properly, data visualization has multiple benefits. It amplifies your message, whatever you want to convey, and your message could be amplified in few different ways. And by taking the time to create data visualizations, you show your audience that you've done your homework, right? That alone gives a sense of credibility to your content. And without visualizations, uh, you run the risk of your audience not understanding what you're trying to present. Your data could even be received as a meaningless uh, or your entire message could be lost, right? So one of the best things about data visualization is that they are accessible and easier to share across, like be it, let it be your colleague or to your client or in any aspect that is going to kind of work better, right? So if you see the pictures shown on the slide, that is also a data visualization which is superimposing the Titanic over the some of the relatively new cruise ship to demonstrate that the new ship is almost say 5 times bigger. So we'll take few examples to before I talk more about this. So we know that companies have becoming more reliant on data, whether it is a small company or a big giant. The number of people speaking the language and data has increased, right? So with all these participants in this language, they begin creating a lot of more graphs. And unfortunately, not all of these graphs are effective, right? There are plenty of ineffective graphs out there, especially in the workplace. So here, uh, uh, I'm gonna share some knowledge with you that is both a blessing and somewhat, and sometimes it could be portrayed as a curse as well. So in order to create effective, impactful data communications, you're gonna have to learn how to spot when they are ineffective. So in this slide, uh, I'll show you how to identify ineffective graphs so that you can identify the key components that make them fall short of or fall short of effectiveness, right? But once you've learned this information, you know you will be able to spot any ineffective graph, and uh, then you'll realize you see that very often, right? So if you take a look at this particular graph which I'm showing, One problem with this particular graph is that it it shows some data. It is showing some colors. It is showing about the maybe quarterly, monthly sales along with the quarter being divided. But to be frank, there is no intended message on this particular graph, right? So there are various principles which are laid down by uh, very good graphic designers such as Edward Tufte. So as you look at this graph, uh, you ask a question: what is the message or story here? Does it come across clearly, or do you have to interpret the graph and infer the intent of the author about what the data is telling to you? So uh, is it effective? So the answer is, I would say, it is kind of cluttered, it is kind of messy, and it looks very busy in the sense something is being conveyed, but what exactly is it? We're not getting a clue. So there's a lot going on in this graph, and it distracts uh, the intended message, or maybe the author was trying to convey something, but somehow that is not happening. So, or the communication is unclear and ineffective. So we can just think what could be the intended message of this visualization. Uh, there could be various interpretations. There will be various perspectives to that. So there isn't really like a single answer. But looking at the visualization, I could say that a lot of different things, such as maybe quarter four was a relatively steady quarter of sales, or perhaps the author intended to communicate that quarter one was very varying sales period. And these are my guesses. I don't know whether it is right, or the whoever created this graph was intending to give that message. So the intent is not clear. We are left out with many guesses, right? So as an audience, what we are doing is analyzing the visualization and trying to infer a message which isn't what you want to happen, right? So the intent of a visualization is to communicate a message, but here the graph is leaving us kind of confused and with only guesses. So the data and the figures, they could be accurate and they could be true, but because of the presentation of what information, of this information, the graph fails to convey a clear message, meaning it won't have an impact on your audience, right? So the same data, let me put it in a different way. Let's take a look at this graph. So this graph represents the exact same data as the one before, but this time we have removed, say, all the graph elements that distract the viewer. If you go back here, you had some x-axis, some y-axis, right? So those things I've just removed. I've just stepped it down with just the components that convey the information. So again, if I ask the question, is this an effective graph? So I would say the graph is kind of smart, easy to understand, and kind of coherent. But again, does that mean that whether this graph is effective? Is this graph tell a compelling and clear story? So can you clearly tell what the author has intended? Again, the answer is no, right? So we have cleaned up the graph. We have removed certain distracting elements out of the graph, but still it doesn't tell a story, which highlights the fact that data communications require more than a well presented graph. So with the increase in number of people who are fluent in the language of data, more and more graphs are being created in the workplace, right? There are far more graphs that are impactful and persuasive. So a graph like this simply falls short of effectiveness again, right? So to be able to converse in the language of data is more than just a tidy graph, right? So it's about communicating a story with impact. So this is where, as I mentioned, engineers or designers often fail to achieve a balance between this form and function. So creating gorgeous data visualization which fails to serve their main purpose, which is nothing but to communicate the intention or communicate the information. So without the proper context, this graph alone doesn't fulfill that purpose. It presents data well, but it doesn't communicate a story. So uh, again, we can say that this is also not an effective graph. So if I'm putting myself in the shoes of a sales manager, maybe having a monthly meeting on sales, and this was the graph that was presented, and the presenter says, "Here are the monthly sales," and shows you this graph, right? So there'll be a lot of questions that you want to ask to the author to understand what is the point in showing this graph. So, are the sales going good, or why was the previous month so low, or are the sales maybe continuing to rise, or what is a seasonal sales period? So, a well presented graph shouldn't leave the audience with these many questions about what is that thing the author is trying to say, right? So, I'll just take you the same data, but maybe a different graph. So this is a different visualization. So the data is same as in the previous graphs, but we have introduced some visual design elements that reinforce the story of the visualization. You have colored it. You have maybe mm, uh, did some or taken into attention the aesthetics aspect, coloring space, size, or text, which has been used to maybe craft a narrative. So in this example, the graph and the numbers don't stand alone. The numbers now act as a reinforcement to the narrative that is being presented to the viewer. So without being a part of this organization, you can instantly understand the story, what's going on there, or in this particular graph. So the organization had a period of continuous growth, and then due to maybe economic factors, they had a dip of say 5% in sales, right? Which by March they had recovered. So this is an example of effective communication with data, and this also highlights two equally important aspects of impactful data communication. Not only you need a graph or graphs that are comprehensive and clear, you also need elements of visual design to create an effective narrative. So uh, we'll just take a look at another aspect. So we'll review some graph examples and identify the components that make them effective or ineffective at communicating with data. So uh, we can create impactful data communication, just like I've shown in the previous slide. But let's take some example and understand why they are effective and why is it not effective, right? Or what needs to be done to make an impactful data communication. So as we go through each example, if you have any question, please don't hesitate to stop me and ask that. So what we're trying to do is we are going to strike the right balance between a clear, understandable graph and the one that communicates a story. So what you see in on the slide is the manager of a call center. Maybe imagine that he has approached the HR to make the case to hire maybe additional staff. So uh, if you review this data communication, does the author communicate effectively? Ultimately, it's a table. So uh, the author has started with maybe a title which explains that what these numbers are telling us, that and they need additional stuff. So uh, they provided some comments that read as number of calls or number of calls increase and customer feedback decreases. Though, so they had an increase in calls from maybe September 2019, and they need additional staff to maintain high customer feedback. That's what the intention. So they provided a table that shows months and the number of calls and also the average feedback rating, which we can see from September, the number of calls increases and the average feedback, it actually kind of decreased. So this communication clearly lays out or shows the reason why more staff should be hired. So this basically shows the impact to the business if they don't hire more staff. So in terms of communicating information, this data visualization definitely kind of is good, but however, it doesn't do that effectively. So we'll just review this graph again. So the, the narrative being communicated to the audience and the numbers are used to reinforce that message, right? So they're just that uh, the graph itself was not effective. uh, and one reason could be the way in which you have chosen to visualize that. It was just a table, and it contains a lot of irrelevant data, and the design could be improved from a visual design principle, right? But uh, I'm just going to highlight the good and bad aspects of graph so that you can start identifying them like whenever you see one, right? So all with the graphs that you create, this aspect could be kept in mind, right? So maybe we'll first remove some irrelevant points, right? The audience doesn't need to need this many months of data to understand the key message. We only need enough data points to highlight the average rating was high in the previous months when the call center experienced an increased number of calls that had lowered the average feedback rating. So this could be even plotted as a bar chart instead of a table, or this kind of a chart that contains two series. So this is a far better choice of visualization as it communicates the message maybe far more quickly. The visual nature of this graph encourages the eye to compare, right? Plus visually, it is easier to pick out the trends. So maybe some more aspect, if you think we can, if you apply some design thinking principles to this visualization. So the same data, again, I have just did it, and we have created an effective communication here. It communicates a clear story, and it does that effectively. So every element of the visualization, right from color to the labels and the written words, they kind of add to your story. One more example, if you look, uh, again, it's also related to business. So imagine that an IT manager works for a large organization that mainly works on internal projects, and the projects of the IT team, they basically recharge the resources back to the organization. So imagine that in the past couple of months, this manager's team had worked on 4 projects, and let's assume the finance department is confused as to why project 4 and 1, despite having virtually the same amount of chargeable hours, are being charged at different amounts, right? So the IT manager tries to give a reply, or like to make it clear, he made a graph, like what you can see here. So from this graph, can you point out what could be the reason why project 1 and project 4 cost such different amount, right? So the reason is actually because project 4 was more complex and required different resources, and that is the reason why the charge at higher rates than that, and as a when compared to project 1. So but the data is not conveying this particular message. So this example of data communication contained many of the right elements. It had a clear readable graph that was easy to understand, but only once you know, or only once he tells like this is what I want to convey, then only we'll get that message, right? So the communication also contained text and other elements, but they all wherein contributing to the story, right? So a good and effective data communication will resonate with an audience, and it contains all these elements, and it could be well presented with some graphical and text elements. But all these components together should tell the same story rather than distracting, right? So if they aren't concisely kind of singing the same tune, then you end up with a maybe musical mess, right? So how can we change this communication to be more effective, like in harmony, right? So the first thing could be any graph you take, the first thing could be the title. So the reason for this communication excess is like you want to communicate that project 4 had more expensive resources than project 1. So let's use that as the title. And if I change the same data and convert it into another graph, the revised version, so straight away the finance department uh, will be able to understand what is the reason, and they'll be able to kind of just, or they'll be able to understand what is the justification provided by this manager. So we can see the hours of each of these resources and how it is being put, and here the cost of the resources between kind of both these projects. So it's clear as to like why it is being done like that. So each element that you show here, it is being used to reinforce the narrative, and that narrative was spelled out clearly. So we took an maybe earlier example also, like whatever we wanted to communicate, initially it was ineffective, and how we can make it effective. These two aspects we have seen, right? So in the upcoming slides, we'll take a look at visual communication, and also how do you tell a compelling narrative with graphics, so that uh, you can use these tools when creating data communications, right? So we'll take a very quick, short 1 minute break, so that you can just think about the relevance of data communication, and also about data visualization. And of course, if you have any questions I mean, from whatever till we have spoken, uh, you are free to ask.
I haven't, we are fine. I think we can continue
Okay.
after the minute is up.
Yes, yes. All right. So so far we have looked at why speaking the language of data is an important skill in today's world. We looked into what is an effective data communication, and how to identify the components of an effective communication, and also know what makes an ineffective communication. So from this point onwards, we'll discuss on this visual communication to make impactful data communication. We'll uh, we'll borrow some tools from visual design and visual perception practices. So what are these tools, and how do they apply to data visualization? So communicating visually, and especially in the language of data, usually I tell it is more like cooking, right? Anyone can eat a meal and form an opinion about it without having to take a course in food science, right? We can eat a meal and know whether or not we liked it, right? We may be even be able to describe some aspects of the meal that we enjoyed, such as the maybe it had a richness or texture that we liked, without knowing what you're actually doing it, or it could be like describing that as a maybe from a food scientist perspective, it could be a myriad of reaction of different amino acids, right? So similarly, the same goes with data visualization as well. You can see a graph or data communication and just uh, sense if it was effective or if it resonated with you. You could possibly even describe the components that you liked, such as it was insightful or informative. And you can do this without having a degree in visual perception. So if you wanted to pursue a career as a chef, uh, you would have to have at least functional knowledge of food science, right? So equally, if you want to create data communication that drive decisions and impress an audience, equally, if you want to create a data communication that drive decisions and impress, and you should probably know little or something about visual perception. So let's take a look at the broad concepts and try to understand how do I create impactful graphs. So when we talk about visual perception, it is nothing but the ability to interpret the surrounding environment using the light in the visible perception, right? So that's how you interpret visual images. So it's about how we as human beings and how our brain process images and turns colored shapes into understanding emotions or ideas. So you can think about the emojis, what we used to convey during a conversation, right? There's an entire field of research on this topic for different disciplines, be it be psychology or child development or graphical design. But when it comes to the application of like this aspect, that is data visualization, there are five aspects. One is order, the other is hierarchy, then you have clarity, then you have relationships, and then you have the convention, right? So uh, we'll just explore these things and how do you apply this over a data visualization. So uh, when you talk about order, visual perception is unlike text. uh, it may not have that order. So in text there is an agreed upon like standard or order in which we read, right? So if you think about any English text, right, we read from left to right and then like top to bottom, right? So if I flip the words around, so that and if I ask you to read from top to bottom and left to right, then it's completely unreadable, right? It may not make much sense, or I would say it's a complete mess, right? So it's difficult to read if somebody is asking you to do that. So even though the letters are same and they are put together in the same way to create those words, so the passage is really challenging to read. So regardless of the culture, the written word confirms to these kind of standards. So if you buy uh, any book, always we know that conventionally it is being like written from left to right and you read it from top to bottom, right? So when it comes to visual perception, there is no agreed standard by which we follow, even in data visualization. So so if you take a look at this typical data visualization, so uh, in this particular graph, uh, what is the first thing which you have noticed? Maybe some people would have noticed the legend which is written in the axis, and uh, maybe uh, the for some people would have seen or read the title. So the order in which each one perceive this is going to differ, right? So it's good to be aware that the order in which viewers interpret your graphs could vary from person to person. There is no right order to view this in. So each viewer will read and understand this visualization in a different order. So in fact, most people wouldn't have even read the title first. Maybe they would have seen this two colored lines. That is the portion where their eye had first, I mean, looked into. Right. So the way data visualizations are read and understood is kind of sporadic, and the eye jumps around the chart, darting between different components, right? So as you can, even now if you are looking, you probably notice the uh, order that is not structured, right? Maybe one person would have seen the x-axis and another person would have seen the title first, right? So what you need to know is that you can design your visualization to lead the audience around and help them to guide to understand what is the message you want to convey, right? So this is one order which it could vary from people to person, right? And historically, if you look at this data visualization, that is also a little interesting. So this is uh, one of the visualization which was drawn uh, by Charles Joseph Minard. It's one of the most famous data representation. So before we analyze this graphic, I'll just talk about the history behind this one. So in the year, I think 1812, Napoleon was doing pretty well for himself, and he has most of Europe under his control except for UK. So no matter how many times he tried to invade them, he couldn't break through their defenses, and his plan was to place an sorry place an embargo on them, so forcing the other European countries to stop trade with UK, which would weaken them enough so that he could invade and take over easily. So uh, the Tsar Alexander of Russia sees that Napoleon was becoming too powerful, so he refuses to participate in this embargo. Right? So angry at this decision by Alexander, so Napoleon gathers a massive army of maybe 400,000 in number, and he started to attack Russia in 1812. Right. So while Russia's troops are not as numerous as France, Russia has a plan. Russian troops keep retreating as Napoleon's troops move forward, burning everything they pass, ensuring that the French forces could not take anything from their environment. So eventually, the French army follows the Russian army all the way till Moscow and suffered major losses due to lack of food and other facilities. So by the time Napoleon gets to Moscow, he knows that he has to retreat because winter has settled in and temperature has dropped, and he returned to France due to lack of food, disease, and because of the weather condition. So that is being depicted in this visualization. So we have many dimensions of data that takes several individual graphs to be represented. But this Minard's graph is quite clever because of its ability to combine all these dimensions into a single chart. The loss of life at a time, location, temperature, geography, historical context, all into one simple graphic. Right. So he shows these various details without distracting um, text or labels. So he displays the points where Napoleon's troops divide into subgroups by breaking out the main bar into different branches. And he adds thin lines to represent maybe a river crossing. So, and also the diminishing troops, that is also very clearly being shown. You have gone with a very thick line towards Russia, and you are coming back with a very thin line. Right? So he's able to show the a drastic loss in life from just a single graphic. Right. So right from this visualization, data visualization as such has improved a lot over the centuries. So especially with the increased influence of data science, AI, machine learning, all these key terms, there are a lot of visualization happening. So I'll just show you some of that. There are a lot of options, and sometimes even if you have all the techniques, even if you have all the tools, choosing the visualization is always a crucial aspect. So if you choose a wrong visualization, then even if your data is right, and even if you have put it right, but still if it is not communicating with your audience, then it may not make much sense. So I'll just try to briefly give an overview about the different kinds of data which you might come across, especially from a visualization perspective. So uh, usually we have the quantitative data where you have numerical values that could be used to indicate things like say magnitude or any value which kind of tells you how many or how much, right? Or it could be some arithmetic operations. So all these could be performed on this quantitative data. So the table which you can see on the slide, even if you want to sum all the values in table 1.3, I can do that because basically it is a quantitative variable. But when it comes to categorical data, they are like labels or names, and you may not be able to do any sort of arithmetical uh, operations on that data. We can summarize categorical data by maybe counting the number of observations or computing the proportions of observation in each category. So if you take the industry column in this particular graph, that is one example of categorical data. So you have different companies. So if you just take a look at these companies, there are two companies in the food industry, Coca-Cola and McDonald's. However, we cannot perform any arithmetic operation directly on the data in that industry column. So that is one example of uh, categorical data. Then we have cross-sectional data, where the data is being collected from several entities at the same time, or maybe approximately at the same point in time. So uh, if you think about cross-sectional, in this data also you have 30 different companies, so that uh, at the same point in time, right? So I'm not going into the depths of like how do you do this and how exactly you categorize this. So, and in addition to that, you also have this time series data. So where the data are collected over several points in time. It could be in like per minute or per hour, or in daily you are collecting something, or monthly you are collecting something. So graphs of time series data are frequently found in business, or yeah, whether it is with respect to technology or with respect to economic aspects. So in these cases, such graphs will help analysts to understand what happened in the past, and also identify trends over a time, which will help you to take future decisions. So graphs of this sort, right, which can kind of project what is happening, right? So if you take a look at this particular graph, the values from I think 2010 January to April. So it shows an upward trend, and there was a steep decline, maybe due to the COVID pandemic, right? So like this, you will be able to deal with different kinds of data. So one more aspect we'll just see before we wind up. So we know that we hear these terms like big data, data engineering, data scientist, and uh, we we all agree that data is definitely the new oil. You've heard all these hype, right? So I don't need to convince you that being data driven is important, but data, facts, and numbers rarely get us excited and motivated to take action. So humans are hardwired to engage with stories. So there's this four-step process for telling compelling stories with data, which is known as 4Ds of data storytelling. So what you see on the screen is a poorly designed chart that is devoid of data storytelling, and we are going to give it a makeover step by step. And right now I would say we have a data dump. Some raw data is being just like that plotted, and somebody had shown his engineering skills over there to show that uh, he knows certain statistical aspects. So that is what is being shown there, but unfortunately it is not conveying any story, right? So some data is being grabbed showing the worldwide market share of major web browsers. So this is being plotted in Microsoft Excel and with the default settings, right? So the step one, usually we say it is known by the name distill. So there are different noteworthy trends buried in this chart that we could choose to focus on, but we need to distill down to the most critical insights that are valuable to the specific audience which you are looking onto. So imagine that you want to show to the YouTube viewers, and imagine that YouTube is the audience, and the trend that stands out most uh, is the rapid rise in Google Chrome's market share, which has more than doubled in the last 8 years. So for a broad audience or like a well-known product's explosive growth is the most relevant story. Now imagine that you're presenting the same data to an audience of, say, iPhone, iOS developers, right? So in that case, they may be much more interested in the market share of Apple's maybe Safari browser. So especially on mobile devices. So our role as data storytellers is to determine what insights will best serve our audience needs. Once we have established what our audience needs or needs to know, we want to convey our insights in a very subtle way. So let's get rid of our boring title. Right now it is Global Web Browser Market Share. So this title merely tells our audience that what's in the chart, but not why they should care about that chart. So I can convert this into a title such as maybe Chrome, Google Chrome crushes the competition. So that title could be just like could look like a maybe newspaper headline, right? It's capturing the key insight using just 4 words, and even it uses some maybe dramatic words to capture the audience attention. And so usually, as I said, the first step is distill, and the second step is to display. So we have a critical choice to make. How do you display the data visually? So there are different options. You have uh, uh, dozens and dozens of different kinds of dozens and different kinds of graphs. It could be a bar chart, it could be scatter plot, it could be maybe histogram. So how do you choose these things, right? So the display is the next aspect. So the current graph, if you see here, even I feel little dizzy if you're constantly looking onto that, right? So this is a known as a stacked bar chart, which looks ultra busy. And the go-to choice for visualizing trends over time is generally could be a line chart. So compared with a stacked bar chart, uh, we can see that lines facilitate a faster or a easier comparison of each product's market share, right? So if I can convert it into a maybe a line chart, it looks like this, right? So once we have selected this kind of an or maybe optimum chart, we are ready for the next step. So first step is distill, second step is maybe design, and third is nothing but declutter. So we must declutter and eliminate any visual component that are not working hard to support our key message about maybe Google Chrome's stellar growth, right? So let's take out some of these grid lines. I've gone too far. Just a second. So let's assume that we'll take those grid lines and we'll simplify our x-axis and remove all that unnecessary repetition of years and months. We'll also eliminate the legend at the bottom of the chart and maybe put the maybe labels close on the maybe right hand side, so that or to the left hand side, so that like each line at the starting itself we'll have like to which browser it belongs to. So we'll make our chart a lot less busy, and basically that is our final step, that is to direct and make sure that the audience see what you intend to show them, right? So we need to direct our audience attention to the components of our visualization that support our key insights. So we can highlight maybe Google Chrome with a different color. So the strategic use of color basically enables our audience to immediately identify that the data supports our title, and the key takeaway from the graph is very clearly understood to the audience. So we have a clutter free, maybe a gray chart, and we have an ideal blank canvas for storytelling. So we could then choose to highlight some different insight if you want to show like the growth of maybe Safari browser. So like this, you will be able to deal with this kind of a like data, right? So to transform from a data dump to a data story, these 4 Ds basically distill is the most critical insight that your audience needs, and display the data using the best visualization type to showcase your insights, and declutter or remove any distracting or unnecessary components from your visualization, and direct your audience attention so that the first thing they see will be the most critical component of your visualization to support your key insight, right? So this is how you can turn visualization into a story, right? So we have seen how to create a clutter free impactful graph that highlights attention, and we also know how to make it look smart and presentable, right? With certain design rules, but we haven't gone into the depth of that. How do you really tell a great story out of that? So all these components, what we have seen, if you apply to our graphs, really tie everything together, that will definitely tell a great story, right? So uh, the biggest pitfall of good communication, as I mentioned, is the title. When most people create graphs, they use a title that describes a graph rather than the one that informs the viewer of the story. So when you present your visualization to your audience, they begin scanning the page for clues, or they'll be kind of left with a lot of guesses only, right? So there's one more aspect I'll just introduce here. They are known as call outs. So call outs are the bits of text and labels placed directly on the graph or around it. So sometimes it's an indicator. It could be a number, or it could be a line, or an arrow pointing to something, or a textual description. Sometimes off to the side of the graph. So some graphs themselves, they're having callouts written on them. So things like bar chart, or maybe line graphs, you can add labels and write to or write a description to help the viewer inform like what exactly you are trying to convey, right? So one such aspect I'll just show. So this really helps to communicate that story, especially when you have created a presentation or some kind of a report, and then the audience views this medium later. They may forget all the conversation that they had in the communication, but they won't forget because it's written down on your graph or next to it. So they totally understand the full story, right? So uh, this graph here, the employee call outs in both, it has been kind of added more value to this visualization, and it sort of completely uh, tells or spells out what the graph is saying, right? So you'll notice that this graph, the data takes the second place. The line itself of this line chart isn't really what's in the focus. So we have summarized the whole thing with a little story to the right. So the final element you need to introduce to your data visualization is what I call indicators. So these are the little numbers placed around the visualization. It's something you compare with your graphs that sort of give additional information and context about what the audience is actually seeing. So uh, it helps the place that data in some sort of context, which allows them to easily understand more about what the story is about that you are trying to say, right? So one more aspect we'll just see. So if you take a look at this graph, the main point of the data is that market size of South region has grown by 45%. But this offer has contextualized with the indicator that shows if the business captured that market, they can expect to pay maybe 1.2 million increase in revenue. Right? So this is what you can call as an indicator. It's a little number placed to the side or around the communication that helps to contextualize the numbers that the audience are seeing. Right? So in this case, the story is that they grew in market size and have contextualized by showing how much that is the revenue in dollar, which amounts to this business. And this actually really adds a lot of depth to your visualization and helps to kind of without taking much space, it communicates a lot of aspects, right? So you can do so by telling a main story with your data visualization and then adding some contextual indicators to help resonate and let the information sink into your audience, right? So that summarizes everything you need to know about creating impactful data visualization that will resonate with an audience and ultimately drive results. Right? So I know for the past 1 hour, uh, everything we have learned is kind of a bit theory based, but for all these aspects, there are tools and frameworks available, even programming aspects as well as non-programming tools, which can do this in a very handy way, in a much more easy way as well, right? So if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to take that.